Okay, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. We are joined by one of our very favorite guests. Dr. Josh Rasmussen is here again. We're going to get a sneak peek, a little taste of some of the wonderful insights that we're going to find in his new and upcoming book. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. We were getting very excited behind the scenes, and we decided,
Thank
you know what,
you.
we just gotta get started with this.
Yes, me
So we don't
too.
get
I
too
mean,
far
I have
ahead.
to
Yeah.
say, Pat, after I produced the first draft of the book and I sent it off to the publisher,
Mm-hmm.
for whatever reason, like I was just imagining myself with you on your show talking about it. And I think because you draw me out so well on this topic, we've had some conversations before on consciousness, and I have some new thoughts that I want to talk about with you on this topic that have become clearer to my mind in the course of my research. So yeah, I'm very excited about this, and I'm
Yeah.
glad that we could do this together.
Yeah, so I've got a million things I kind of want to ask you about, but I also want you to kind of lead the conversation in a path that's just consistent with some of these new discoveries that you made, because I
Yeah.
really want you to share some of those. But before we got started, you were saying that there's a new really kind of important question that you think that needs to be staged at the beginning. So can we rewind like 40 seconds to when we were just talking about that behind the scenes and maybe just kick it off there?
Yeah. So previously we talked about consciousness on your show, and I distinguished between two questions. One question is like, what is consciousness? I call this the identity question. Like, if you're having a conscious feeling of happiness, what is that feeling? Is it a neurological state in a brain? Is it something else? What, right? So that's the identity question. And then after you're thinking about that question, that can help you with the second question, which is, where does consciousness come from, or what does it depend on? So I call that the dependence question. But in my research on the consciousness into the subject, it became very apparent to me that there's a third question that's really important to distinguish between those two, which is, what's the thing that has the consciousness? This is different than what is consciousness or even where it comes from. It's like, what is the subject of consciousness? William Hasker, in his book, The Emergent Self, he talks about what consciousness is and then where it comes from, how it can emerge. But even in discussing where it comes from, he focuses in on like what kind of things have the consciousness. Is it like little, bits of mindless matter that together collectively have a mind, right? And so, because even if the little bits of mindless matter produce a mind, a conscious mind, it doesn't follow that the things that have the conscious mind is the bits of matter themselves.
Right.
This is a point that Hasker draws out very skillfully, because he makes the argument that even if you can get a personal being emerging out of matter, it doesn't follow that the material things themselves are the things that are the subject of the consciousness,
Right.
versus something else, namely a personal subject.
Yeah. So, and I'm sure we'll get a little bit deeper into emergence as we go along, because this is obviously one of the major themes here. Are you kind of taking, and let me know if I'm getting too far ahead in the conversation here. Are you kind of taking maybe like a broadly Aristotelian view here of that we need substances, right? Is this kind of where
Yes.
we're going with this, right? And that even if you can have, this is something I've been thinking about a lot too, right? Even if you have certain conditions that are met, where something emerges, right? It seems like that, like we seem like we want something more from that. Like, is there a new form that's introduced into reality there at that point, right?
Yes, there's the thing that has the consciousness, right? And then what's that? Like, for example, this Lego piece. If somehow this Lego piece, maybe I rotate it in a certain way, and then out comes a being, okay? Or it somehow facilitates consciousness. Well, again, there's those three questions. What's the nature of the consciousness? Where does the consciousness come from? Well, maybe let's say it came from this Lego somehow. Well, then there's still, what's the subject of the consciousness? Is it the Lego that's conscious, or is there something else? And just distinguishing those questions, I feel like part of making progress in this inquiry involves just carefully distinguishing one thing from another.
Right.
And I don't think that one can be too careful to separate concepts. I think actually a lot of confusion comes in precisely because people are kind of talking past each other. There's a lot of concepts in play, and people aren't seeing distinctions between them.
Yeah. Excellent. All right, that's really helpful, and I think that's a good stage setting. Now, I have gotten a little bit through the initial section of your book, and one of the things I always love, it's got a great style. Like, where's your other book? Here it is. Let me get you the plug before we begin. Josh's excellent book, How Reason Can Lead to God. So, you know what? Let me do this. I want to make sure that we thank Josh for his time here. So I will give some copies of this book away in this conversation, your original book. So leave a comment, leave your thoughts either in the live stream or afterwards, and I'll pick a few people and we'll make sure you get a copy of Josh's excellent book here. So as I was saying, it's just very clear, wonderful, engaging style. And you start by saying, well, look, if we're going to do an investigation, we're going to need some tools, right?
Yeah.
We're going to need some tools. Let's get clear on what these tools are, why they're important, and their validity as well. So is that a good place to start, Josh?
That's a wonderful place to start.
tell
and I
me.
just
Okay,
wanted
good.
to say, you know, I actually have my book here too. I picked this up and I was like kind of reading sections of it. See, this has been well edited. My wife actually, I read every and she helped me polish the chapters. And so because it's been well edited, I was reading this and I myself was thinking, oh man, like I've set a high bar for myself for this next book. And it actually made it hard for me to begin writing the next book because I wanted my first sentence to be well polished and well edited. But I've been working on improving the presentation. And one of the things that I do right in the beginning, as you saw, is I set up a metaphor for the kind of investigation we're going to be doing, which is to investigate through a cave of consciousness. And so I lead the reader through a cave of consciousness. And in the beginning, I say, well, we need some tools to help us to explore. So, right, in this book, the metaphor is a bridge of reason. We're stepping across the bridge. In this next book, it's a cave, and we're going to explore. And so I talk about two tools and then how I organize my thinking. So the tools are introspection, by which you can investigate you can look within and notice thoughts and feelings and emotions. And then the other tool is the light of reason, by which you can deduce inferences from your observations. And then I also point out that I want to use a scientific approach. And it's interesting, Pat, because when I first wrote that chapter, I had a section called the Stone of Science. And I actually was talking about how science can be a barrier to entering in the cave of consciousness, because you might think that the scientists already have the answers in terms of, let's say, neuroscience. You study the brain and therefore you know what consciousness is. And so I had a whole section about rolling away the stone, but I actually rewrote that. So you didn't read that section at all. There's nothing in there called that, because as I was reading a lot of the latest science, I realized that it's really, I think, a big distraction to talk about how we're going to roll away the stone of science when science and philosophical reflection are pointing in the same direction. It's not like there's a kind of competition.
Yes.
What there is, though, there are narratives about what science has discovered. And so that's something that I say in the beginning of the book, that sometimes those narratives will actually block you from entering into the exploration, because you might think you already have the answers, but actually the latest science may in fact contradict the narrative about what you think the science is saying.
Yes.
Especially even about the nature of matter itself. So those are basically the tools, the introspection and reason. And then I use a scientific methodology by which I collect observations using introspection and also consult the latest science. And then I use reason to analyze those observations. And I come up with hypotheses that I'm really trying to test with firsthand observations. That's my goal. And I want the readers to feel empowered. Like, you can see these things for yourself by looking within and pay attention to your own consciousness. See if what I'm saying makes sense. You know, you can test this out. You don't have to wait for the authorities to approve of whether you even have thoughts and feelings. You can test that for yourself and look within.
Don't have to wait for the peer-reviewed publication on that one, huh?
That's right. Yeah, there's no peer-reviewed research on my existence, right? Or what I was thinking this morning.
Is there a study for that? Yeah.
Right. But and yet I have no doubt that I had this experience this morning of drinking coffee. In fact, I still have some right here.
Excellent.
And I know that, not based on scientific research. There's no science that contradicts that. But I do have knowledge. And I think that's important, that you can have knowledge. You can have clarity through this tool of introspection. That's possible.
So could you give us some examples then of how we can use this tool? Because I think this is one of those things that, most people probably, and you're really good with this, Josh, is like something might be so familiar that it's easy to overlook how significant it is.
That's what it is.
Yeah, an example of this.
Yeah, right. So let's go back to that first question. What is the identity question? What is consciousness?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's think of an example. take the feeling of love.
Mhm.
Okay, so I have that feeling of love. I think about my wife, and then it generates that feeling. I focus in, and I detect that I have that feeling. Well, how do I know that I have that feeling? Do I have to look into my brain and check the pattern of particles to see
Mhm.
that I'm having the feeling of love? Do I have to look at my body and see how it's acting to see if I have that feeling of love?
Mhm.
Now, maybe looking at my body could give me evidence that I'm having a feeling of love.
Sure.
Maybe looking at my brain could also give me evidence, but there's this other way, I think, is just looking in, and you can detect feelings right within. You just pay attention. That's what introspection is doing there for me.
Mhm.
So
Yeah,
that
so
would
it's
be an
just sort of this direct acquaintance with it.
yes.
Yeah, excellent. And then what else do we need to know about this tool before we go forward? Are we
Well, yeah. So there are various objections that somebody might
Mhm.
have at this stage, because one of the ways that we can figure out the nature of the world is by looking at brains and
Mhm.
studying them sort of scientifically.
Yeah,
And from this sort of scientific approach, you might start to have worries about whether what you're detecting through introspection is real.
right.
Maybe we can detect brains through our scientific instruments, but are you really detecting thoughts and feelings? Some philosophers have proposed that we eliminate conscious mental states. They're not
Mhm.
actually real.
Right.
And one sort of motivation for this would be that when we look into the physical world and we use our scientific instruments, we
Mhm.
don't really detect that first person qualitative aspect of consciousness.
Mhm.
So the tools of visual observation and hearing don't give us awareness of consciousness.
Right.
And so this is where I think introspection is vitally important to
Mhm.
actually witness this other kind of reality, the consciousness within. But then there can be this question, well, why think introspection is actually revealing anything about
Mhm.
reality? And if the whole journey through the cave of consciousness is going to require this tool, this light of introspection, I want to say a few things about why I think this is a valid tool that we can
Right.
use.
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah.
reliable. Mhm.
Yeah, and so one of the points I make is that a tool doesn't have to be 100% reliable in every context
Mhm.
in order to be to provide some information, right? So,
Right.
I mean, even your eyes, they don't have to be 100% reliable. It's not like when I see things
Mhm.
that it's impossible for me to be hallucinating,
Mhm.
where vision is not 100% reliable. But it doesn't follow from that I don't have any confidence that I'm ever seeing anything, right? Or that I have no information from my eyes. Same thing with introspection. I don't think you have to have 100% infallible reliability to have information through introspection. So that's just
Mhm.
like a distinction I think is worth making.
Mhm.
But then the other thing, I make the argument that actually, in order to do science, you have to make observations, and then you have to be able to test those observations. You can make hypotheses that you can then see if they match those observations.
Mhm.
But the only way you can even know whether you've made any observations or whether the observations match your hypothesis is by using that tool of introspection to look
Yeah.
within and notice, oh, I've observed this.
Mhm.
Or, oh, I can see from within my own mind that these observations don't match this hypothesis. I think it's actually that light of introspection that allows you to see those very things. And so that the reason I make that argument is that I think sometimes people who can become skeptical of introspection,
Mhm.
they are optimistic about scientific investigation. So I think it's
Yes.
helpful to make the link between introspection is actually part of science. It's actually something that is sort of implicit in our
Yeah.
ability to detect our own experiences as observers. To
Right.
even know that there are scientists,
Mhm.
one has to be able to be aware of oneself as a conscious being and
Mhm.
others as personal conscious beings as well. And I think that one arrives at that through introspection together with reason and inference.
Yeah, excellent. And even argument as well. The sort of
Yes,
feelings that I have of either being persuaded or not persuaded or convinced, all of that. So
that's
so
it.
so, so the idea here is like if it's kind of a package deal, right? If you if you want science, we're going to need like this tool is going to come with it. Maybe in some really bizarre way, you could try and deny both of them, but you can't have one without the other. Is that
Yeah, I
kind of
like
fair?
what you just said there, Pat, that even the feeling of being convinced
Mm-hmm.
by scientific argument, you wouldn't even know that that feeling is real
Right.
apart from your acquaintance with it by introspection,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
And maybe that word introspection can be off-putting to some. Let's just use a different word. It's like you can tell whether you're feeling convinced of something.
Mhm.
That sense of telling is what I mean by introspection. It's that sort of awareness of your own feelings.
Yeah. I can see how maybe people might have different associations with the word introspection, but I know exactly how you're using it, and I think it's obviously perfectly legitimate. Okay. All right. Good. So we've got that tool, I think, in place. Where do we need to go from here now, Josh?
So we've entered the cave of consciousness.
Excellent.
And we begin. So in my book, I divide the journey into two parts. The first part is about the nature of you.
Yeah.
So what are you? And this is going to relate to that first question, the identity question. What is the nature of your conscious experiences?
Yep.
So we'll talk a bit about that. And then the next part of the journey is about the ultimate origin of you. And that second part involves those two questions, actually, the dependence question, what do you depend on, as well as the subject question, what subject has consciousness?
Right.
So yeah, going into that first question, what I found helpful is just to pay attention and collect observations. And so the way I've set up the journey there is I've focused on things that I detect within myself, and then I invite the reader to consider, do you find these things within yourself? So the first chapter there is on feelings. I find within myself feeling of happiness, curiosity, feeling of joy. And I take some time to analyze that. And just to give kind of an outline, then we move into thoughts. I find thoughts within me, and I talk about what they are. And then there's awareness itself. And so I have a chapter on perception. And then I go in to talk about the value of beings, the body of beings. What is that, and how does that relate to consciousness? And then the first person self, the organizer of all of those elements. And so all of that is devoted to understanding, like, what are you? And once we get careful about understanding what are you, then we're armed to appreciate the second stage, which is, how can a being like you, who has feelings, thoughts,
how could that happen?
Intrinsic value, how could that arise?
Right.
Why does reality include such a thing? How is that even possible? Right. And then we begin to look at some of the different problems with constructing persons. So I talk about a construction problem, a binding or combination problem of how the parts can combine to form a first person self.
Yep.
And then there's also an identity problem, which is what accounts for your identity across time, as well as your identity at any given time. So these are all very complex problems, but what I love about those problems is that by thinking about them, they provide kind of constraints on possible options. And so my whole method is to look at, okay, what's the clearest thing? And so a lot of the book is saying, okay, this is clearly impossible. Once we understand this, then we can say that's not an option. That's not an option. So once you get to the end, you're constrained on all sides. And it's sort of a bit of a mystery how any consciousness could ever arise, ever. But then I finally arrive at a theory that's at least within that narrow range of possibilities.
Yeah. Oh, that's exciting stuff. All right. Well, I want to do all of it. I want to cover all of it, but obviously, we don't have time to do all of it. So we have to kind of like be a little picky and choosy here of what we want to do. All right. So, I mean, I have so many thoughts on a lot of this, and my thoughts on the, at least philosophy of mind, is like, I feel like I definitely know like what seems wrong and false to me, but I don't know quite yet, like, what theory seems correct to me. Like in a broad sense, I do. But as you know, there's lots of theories out there, right? And
there's theories within theories.
There's theories within theories, and it's this whole matrix and cobweb, and it's really messy, right? Of course, you do a really nice job in your book, kind of giving a summary of a lot of the main theories. You have the reductive theories, you have the non-reductive theories, and then and of course we have kind of like these within, I guess, a sort of naturalist worldview. The way I see it is you kind of have like two extremes. You have eliminativism, which you already talked about, right? And as you say in the book, there's something really nice about eliminativism is they really take the first person aspect very seriously.
Yeah.
And they realize, well, if it doesn't fit our model, then it's gone.
Eliminate.
Right? We just get rid of it, right? And most of us think, well, maybe we should adjust our model, right?
I want to just pause you there.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think this is actually a nice point that you're making, because sometimes the eliminativists, they're associated with those who are rejecting our kind of ordinary folk ontology, our sort of ordinary way of thinking about things. So we ordinarily think that there are thoughts and feelings and conscious experiences. And eliminativists are saying, no, there aren't those things, right? And that seems contrary to our ordinary way of thinking about things. However, I think actually part of what's motivating eliminativism is that they're actually seeing something right about our ordinary way of thinking about things, which is that if there is consciousness, okay, there is a kind of first person aspect to it, a kind of what it's like from the inside to have a thought or to have a feeling. And they're taking that very seriously. They're saying, basically it's the conditional. If consciousness is real, this is what it's like.
Yeah.
And they're saying that's basically correct. Like, you're right. If consciousness is real, it has these first person qualitative aspects.
Right.
Right. And so then they're motivating the idea that, well, consciousness isn't real, or we can't fit first person qualitative aspects into a fundamentally physical world. And I really appreciate that. I mean, there's a surprising number of philosophers who follow that path. I cited in the book Alexander Rosenberg, who makes the argument, skillfully expressed, that we don't find in the vocabulary of fundamental physics anything that's about anything else.
Yes. Right.
Right. So what we find are, positions, momentums, and changes in positions. We find a kind of geometric structure, and we find all sorts of other things that can be analyzed in terms of the geometric structure. We can talk about functions of positions and changes within geometry, but we don't find any kind of aboutness and I'm talking about the aboutness you witness via introspection when you focus on your own thoughts. Right. And so then he suggests that we eliminate or shave off thoughts from reality. And I think what he's actually doing is he's taking very seriously the ordinary conception of consciousness as including a kind of first person quality to it.
Yeah. So I know people take jabs at eliminativists. I've always liked them. I don't agree with it.
I appreciate they're being very intellectually honest, following a path of reason.
Yeah.
And, it's not just obvious kind of where the arguments for eliminativism go wrong. I took some time in my editing of my draft. So you got a draft that was a little bit more edited, where I talk about some kind of moves and counter moves with the eliminativists.
You do, and you motivate, I think, and this is very fair and very right, that it seems a lot of these motivations are epistemological, right?
Yeah.
Which is good. So yeah, we can talk more about that if we want. I was just going to say, it seems like to me the kind of other end of the spectrum would be panpsychism these days. And you tell me, just because you probably have a better pulse on the literature, it does seem like things are tending more towards that type of direction. This
recently is generally my feeling. In fact, actually, just this morning, somebody sent to me the updated Phil surveys, and apparently the sort of confidence in physicalism among philosophers is
waning.
Down.
Yeah,
it's waning. I mean, it's still there. It's interesting though, because I remember from the first Phil surveys, I noticed that among the philosophers of mind, a higher percentage of them were not theists, so they didn't believe in a fundamental mind. A higher percentage of them were not theists, but then the percentage of them who were, how do I want to say this? There were still generally physicalists, okay, but the percentage of physicalists was actually less than the percentage of atheists among the philosophers of mind. And I think that's actually a very interesting stat, because it's hard to really think about this question about the nature of the mind wholly apart from these other worldview questions, right?
Yeah.
Because if you think reality has a fundamental mind, then you have different resources for explaining how there can be other kinds of minds and consciousness in the first place.
Right.
And I love how you mentioned panpsychism, because I think what's happening is, from sort of the naturalistic paradigm where there is no transcendent mind that produced the universe, philosophers are sort of working themselves to this idea that, well, consciousness is real. It's not sort of explicable in terms of fundamental physics. So maybe consciousness is actually a fundamental aspect of maybe it's a fundamental aspect of the foundations of reality.
Right. Yeah.
Chalmers talks like this. That consciousness is foundational. Maybe some kind of proto aspects of consciousness. Philip Goff also makes arguments for this.
Yep.
And many other philosophers are kind of pointing in this direction. It's very fascinating to me, because I'm actually sort of seeing them kind of discover theism or a fundamental mind kind of within the context of their worldview.
Yeah.
I mean, even the nature of matter. I was reading this book by Carlo Rovelli, and I've read some of his articles as well, where he makes the case from just contemporary physics that the basic nature of matter is three properties: informational, okay,
Mm-hmm.
Relational, and then you have to wonder, well, what's it a relation to, right?
Right.
Is it relations all the way down, or is there something else?
Mm-hmm.
Some people argue, well, it's relational to mind. I mean, if it's informational, information is a product of minds. Now, he doesn't actually take that route. He doesn't take that. He's not making an argument for a fundamental mind, but he's just saying, our best physics seems to point to informational aspects of matter, relational aspects of matter, and that matter, the fundamental nature of matter, transcends space itself. So that space emerges.
Right.
Our very idea of like space is it's like it's sort of like in a dream, where if you have that sort of phenomenal space in the dream and you have different objects and it looks like there's space there. Well, that's the space in your dream emerges from your own mind, right? So it's like, could the space of our universe emerge from a fundamental mind that's producing these informational aspects of matter itself, right? It's like you're finding God's mind within matter, or you're kind of recharacterizing the nature of matter. So you're rediscovering.
Yeah, that's
this
really
mind.
fascinating to me, because as much as the nature of mind has been a perplexing puzzle, the nature of matter has been for me as well. And I think, I kind of know more what my positions on this aren't than definitely what they do. But this is where I think, like, we were talking about Lonergan and Norris Clark a little bit before. I really like the way they kind of think about this, because Lonergan, he's kind of, I guess, following Aristotle in a long sense, where he says, God is the unrestricted act of understanding of self. And so kind of like at the fundamental layer, you just have fully unrestricted being. And then, like everything else is just being with sets of minuses, right? It's just being with limits and restrictions. And matter traditionally has always been seen as really just principle of limitation and individualization. So then the reason I kind of like that is it seems to resolve, at least broadly, the sort of twin difficulties, right? It's like, well, if you just have matter, then how do you get mind? But also, if you just have mind, how do you get matter? On their review, you just have being, right? And being in its most full expression is mind-like, personal, relational. And then it has the resources to kind of limit things down to various degrees, if that makes sense at all.
Yeah, very much. And and I have new thoughts about what you just mentioned, since the last time we talked about like how you get matter out of mind, especially if the fundamental nature of matter is informational and not fundamentally spatial, right? And I've noticed that I am able with my own mind to generate information, and I'm also able to generate visual imagery. I was doing this again actually just recently, where I was like, it helps if you close your eyes and you could just do this. Like, you focus in on your imagination and then you try to form some images, and then you could try to rotate them. And it's like there's a sense in which there's geometry. There's different ways to analyze, what's going on there. Are you aware of an image that is representing geometry, or is there actual geometry within that image? Right. And this leads us into the philosophy of perception. But it looks like, in some significant sense, when I'm rotating these images, there's a kind of geometric structure that my mind is having power over, right? And so I witnessed this right within that first person experience of my own consciousness. And then I think, well, okay, well then it looks like mind does have this power to generate geometric structures and rotate them. I experienced that directly. And this puts, and this is not even to mention all the scientific research. I've been reading a lot about the neuroscience and how consciousness affects the geometric structures of the brain as well, in the frontal lobe. And you can heal yourself by thinking certain thoughts and focusing on positive things that can affect your brain.
Right.
Yeah. And so I do think that there are solutions to how mind can explain matter that don't apply in the reverse.
Yes.
If you understand matter in these terms.
Right. You just have to think more deeply about what do we mean by matter. And of course, that is a very vexing thing. So that was a very fun, just a little, I guess we're going to just naturally go down little rabbit holes here and there. And
there's many rabbit holes in the cave of consciousness as we continue.
Yeah, good.
There's little rats running around, right?
Yeah. So, okay. So we're just kind of taking a survey. We have eliminativism, we have panpsychism. And I agree with you. It seems like panpsychism is almost a rediscovery of many things that people like us would kind of really want to celebrate. They're like, yeah,
that's right. They take
mind is fundamental. Yeah.
Yeah. Consciousness is real.
Right.
And it's part of fundamental reality.
Right. Yeah.
And so I think it's definitely a step in the right direction. Right. And then I think if you shave off those limits and boundaries from the fundamental consciousness, then you basically do get
then we're
It's
there.
supreme mind, right? Then you're
Yeah.
there, right?
Yeah, then we're there.
Yeah.
So, but then we've got a lot of stuff kind of, I guess, in between, right? So we've got, I guess, would you say that maybe the most kind of popular theory among naturalists is still functionalism, essentially that the mind just is what the brain does, or you know what? Why don't let me have you kind of lead us here from this point. I'm wandering around in circles in the cave. You tell us what direction you want to go with
you know,
this. Yep.
it's interesting because my experience with what philosophers think comes from talking with philosophers at conferences, and also just from reading the literature. And my general impression is that there was kind of this, maybe the 1950s, a kind of focus on analyzing consciousness in terms of behavior. And then kind of soon along that, around that time, there was also this identity thesis, that we could identify the nature of thoughts and feelings with third-person material brain states. You know, which maybe we could analyze in terms of your behavior, or we could just understand something about those brain states. And there are a variety of theories within here. It seemed to me that there was this kind of progress as philosophers who are naturalist philosophers, kind of working out their theory of mind, came up with these challenges, with these kind of reductive theses, these theses that sort of would reduce consciousness to brain matter. One of them would be this multiple realizability problem, which is the problem of how you can account for the evident experience that comes in different systems. So like you and I can have a feeling of pain, but we could also see that other creatures could act like they have pain, and pain can be realized in different systems. As long as this is even logically possible, there's no contradiction in this, then it looks like there's something about the experience of pain that's not the same thing as the realizers, the material, physical realizers of that experience. And so this has led a number of philosophers towards what you mentioned, this sort of functionalist idea that maybe we can understand feelings and thoughts and consciousness in terms of functional aspects of matter. Let me just say, I myself have not been so persuaded by this multiple realizability problem. There's like this story that gets told, and it's nice to follow the story. It's like, you know, the philosophers kind of were working out the behaviorism and the identity thesis. Multiple realizability comes along. Frank Jackson's, what, you know, the neuroscience argument about what Mary can know as a colorblind person looking at a brain. There's that argument. We could go into that. And this kind of moves philosophers towards functionalism. And then there's Jaegwon Kim's causal exclusion argument that applies to functionalism. And then we're sort of all over the map again, right? That's like a story that we can tell. I mean, I don't know if maybe that's actually how it goes in terms of the psychology. But I can just say that for myself, what convinced me the most wasn't this sort of thought experiment about multiple realizability, but rather just paying attention carefully to the character of consciousness and then making comparisons. This isn't the only argument. This isn't the only consideration. But I think that it is possible to get very clear that feelings and thoughts aren't the same as states of brain, and by the same comparison aren't the same as functions of brain states.
No, I love this. Let's follow this, because the two that I always found most persuasive, you're right, the other ones I think are interesting, are the one that I know you're thinking about, which we're going to get into, and then the other one, and I haven't seen this talked about that much, and maybe you even talk about it in your book, I'm not sure. It's sort of Thomistic in spirit, but James Ross develops it. You know which one I'm talking about?
Yes, the thoughts, the functions.
So the idea is that he focuses on formal thinking, but most people would probably say applies to all thinking, is always determinate and exact in its conceptual content, where no physical thing or event could ever be like that, right? It's always open to multiple various interpretations and whatever. And I've always found that it's a very, very fascinating and intriguing argument in different ways. But yeah, let's not get off track.
I actually would just to highlight that, just a note on that. I was watching my kids, they were playing with some Legos, and then my son Micah, he made this kind of a contraption, and he said that his contraption was simulating adding numbers. And this is related to Ross's argument, because we're interpreting what those geometric things are doing in terms of addition. So as minds, people with minds, we're saying, here's what it means for them to add. It's for, at the end of this, there's like 2 marbles in here when you put in, that's what it means to add. But as you point out, I mean, there's infinitely many different ways of interpreting what those things are doing.
Right.
It's a general problem of like which function is actually applying to those motions. There's infinitely many.
Yeah. Yeah, another good, I think a good example of that is if you just draw a triangle on a chalkboard. What does this represent? Does it represent an isosceles triangle? Does it represent? And one example I heard used is that the obscure forgotten pop band triangle from Japan, right? Stuff like that. And the answer is like the physics can't tell us, right? The physics can't tell us, right?
There's infinitely many different concepts, mental items that are consistent with the triangle there, or with the physics. Yeah.
So let's so we can revisit that later if we want. But sure. let's go back to because I think yours is probably going to be much more accessible for most people that they can. And what I love about yours is, again, you can kind of investigate this for yourself. So yes, show us this tool. How are we going to use direct compare? I love how you call it direct comparison.
The direct comparison test. Now let me just say, on a psychological level, I don't know if it's my experience with presenting the argument has invited more questions that require clarification. And so I don't actually know if this is like psychologically the most persuasive, but I can just tell you from my own experience, this is the tool that makes it the clearest for me.
I could see it going either way, because either somebody will see it and be like, that is actually so simple and so profound. I can't believe I haven't noticed before. Or they'll say like, that's too simple.
That's too simple.
I'm skeptical.
I think that's maybe what it is. It's almost like it's too simple. What about science?
Right.
And we'll talk about that. We'll talk about how this fits very well with science. But yeah, it's a direct comparison test. So I like to illustrate with examples. I have a Lego here, and here it's got 4 things. I don't know what you want to call those.
Nubs.
Yeah, nodes. And then here we have some shapes back here, and you can compare directly the things that you're seeing. So, take the number 4, you count those, that's 4. And then you take the number 3, you count those, that's 3. And then I ask you, is 4 different from 3, or is 4 and 3 the same? Now, we're at the foundations here. I mean, that's a very hard question to give an argument, to answer and then justify. Because if you say, well, 4 is obviously different than 3, and I say, well, justify that. Please give me your argument, show me your evidence. We're at rock bottom here.
Yeah. So
I say that you can just see clearly, just within your mind, that 4 and 3 aren't the same thing. You just compare them because they're both within your conscious awareness, the 4 and the 3. Same thing with the shapes. So you can compare the shapes of these nodes with the shapes back here. You can bring them both into your conscious awareness, and you can see that they're different shapes.
Right.
And then you can use this to deduce that like this front side can't be the same thing as this back. Because there's this different geometry back here than there is here. And you can see this very clearly. You just get them both in your conscious awareness, you compare them, you see that they're different.
Right.
Now, what happens if you can't get them both in your conscious awareness? I don't even think I draw this out in the book, but this is helpful. I've been thinking about this recently. Let's say that all you have within your awareness now are these things, and you've never seen the backside. Okay. Does that mean that the backside could be the same as the front side? Absolutely not, because you just admitted that you've never seen the backside, but you've seen the front side. How can that which you've seen be identical to that which you've not seen? That's a contradiction.
Right.
It's a logical contradiction. Now, I think people get confused because both the front side and the backside are part of one thing. Okay.
Right.
They're part of one thing, but these aren't the same side, right? So you can have different aspects united into one thing.
In one reality.
Right. And so the application, I think, is pretty obvious. You can see within your own mind thoughts, feelings, emotions. Okay. You can directly compare them with other things that you can see within your own mind, such as shapes, quantities, functions.
Sand.
And you can test for yourself if they're the same thing. A pile of sand is not a pile of thoughts, right? If thoughts could be piled up. And I think you can just see this very, very clearly. Now, if somebody says, you know what? I actually don't see sand. Because sand, there's different theories of perception, but you might be an indirect realist, meaning that what you directly see is within your consciousness, and sand is actually outside your consciousness. All you really see is a representation of sand in your mind.
Mhm.
It's like, okay, fair enough. I've never seen my brain.
Mhm.
So I can now run the other argument, which is that, okay, that which I've seen is not the same as that which I've not seen. So if all I've seen, if all I'm ever aware of through reflection is thoughts, feelings, and emotions, and I'm
Mhm.
never acquainted with geometric patterns in my brain or neurons in my brain, then they can't be the same thing.
Yeah.
Now, somebody watching this or listening to this, they might think, okay, maybe what's going on is you are seeing the same thing in two different ways.
You just don't
Two different,
realize it.
you don't
Sure.
realize it, right? So maybe when I'm inspecting my thoughts and I'm having a thought about you,
Mhm.
that thought just is a structure of neurons. That's what it is. It's not what it's correlated with. That's what it actually is.
Right.
And that I'm actually aware of that brain structure how do I want to say this? I can be aware of my thoughts through first person experience, but then I can be aware of the brain through scientific instruments.
Mhm.
And so there's two different ways of being aware of the same thing.
Mhm.
But here I just want to make the point that I don't have first person conscious access to the state, to the geometries of my brain.
Yeah.
And that's enough, right? Because even if there are two different ways of looking at the same reality, this is why, like we were saying earlier, we have to make distinctions here, right? So even if there are two different ways of looking at the same reality, I can then focus on one of my ways, first person introspective access. And then I can just ask myself, okay, do I right now have first person introspective access to geometric states of axons firing in my brain? And I don't. If I do, then first person access is not what I mean by it, because first person access just is the kind of thing that when I have that access, I'm also able to be aware that I'm having that access, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like if
It does.
I'm accessing my thoughts, I can be aware that I'm accessing my thoughts,
Right.
at least in principle.
So yeah, this is really good, and it's very helpful because I think you've already addressed one of the most common objections, but you do draw a very, again, sometimes I guess maybe people get annoyed if philosophers draw too many distinctions, but as you say,
It's
you can't
helpful.
be too careful with these things.
Yeah.
I sometimes laugh because if you go back to the old scholastics, it's like distinction upon distinction upon
I know.
virtual major, virtual minor distinction. But then you kind of like come to appreciate how somebody could get there, right?
Strengths can be weaknesses and weaknesses can be strengths.
Right. But you do draw, I think, a very important and necessary distinction between direct and indirect awareness, because
That's
one of the common objections to this flavor or brand of argument is, well, look, morning star, evening star. This is one of the common ones, right? Or water and H2O. That's probably
it, yeah.
another even more common one. So look, you seem to be aware of water, but we know water is H2O, and you're not aware of that. But water is H2O, right? Now we could say, like, is it? In what sense? That I actually think is a really fascinating question. But maybe we could
I know what you mean.
we could just grant that for the sake. So yeah, let's talk about that and maybe introduce the distinctions that you use to help us through that. Yeah, that example that people pose as a counterexample to the argument.
Yeah, right. And you pointed to it in terms of direct awareness versus indirect awareness. So, this isn't water, but there's liquid in here, and so I'm experiencing it now. Let me give myself some data of experience.
Excellent. Yeah, I'll take a little data myself. I got my sparkly water.
Yeah. Now, who knows what this is really made out of? Who knows what its molecular structure is? Okay. I don't really detect its molecular structure just by detecting the properties of it that I'm experiencing, because the properties that I'm experiencing are within my immediate direct awareness. Whereas the molecular structure, that's not what I'm directly aware of. That's something that may be causing what I'm directly aware of. And so the first point here that I'd make is that the things that I'm directly aware of are not the same thing as the causes of those things that are outside of my direct awareness.
Right.
Now, this isn't going to be a fully satisfying response, because the worry is that, wait a minute, isn't water the same thing as H2O? You think you're aware of water without being aware of H2O. But since water is H2O, then you can't actually be aware of water without being aware of H2O. So there's got to be something wrong with the argument. This kind of objection doesn't really diagnose exactly what's wrong with the argument. It just says there's got to be something, because we know that water is H2O, and we know that we can be aware of water without being aware of H2O. And then my response to that is just to go back to this clarification. It's like, well, wait a minute. What I'm directly aware of are my experiences with water. Okay. I'm not directly aware of the molecular structure of water. So if what you mean by water is the molecular structure of water, then I don't have direct awareness of that molecular structure, so I can't even apply
Yeah.
the direct comparison test. You apply the direct comparison test when you have direct acquaintance with the items that you're comparing.
Mm-hmm.
Or if one of the items is within your direct awareness, like the experiential effects of water,
Mm-hmm.
and then the other item is not within your direct awareness, like the
Mm-hmm.
molecular structure of water, well, then you can infer that there's a difference between the molecular structure and its experiential effects. Those aren't the same thing. There's no
Yes.
problem there.
Right. Yeah. So maybe we can do, so like, for example, I mean, one could contemplate like, is water H2O for a long time? It's a really interesting thing, but like, say there's a property of water, say liquidity, right? And it
Yes.
seems like, yeah, we can reduce this to the calculable properties of the molecular structure, right? But take wetness, right? That's the other example,
Yes,
right?
there you go.
Wetness. Well, now it seems like we can't, right? Now it seems like I'm directly aware of the wet.
Wetness includes that feeling aspect, the
Right,
sense.
that feeling aspect, that sense
That's it.
aspect there, right? And that's where the direct comparison test is going to apply, right?
Exactly. That's right. Yeah, because
Yeah.
liquidity, you can give a functional analysis of it in terms of its molecular structure.
Right.
And if that's what you mean, because I hear what you're saying, it's like, well, we can even debate exactly, is water H2O? And the reason there is that debate is because we have to get clear about like what we mean. What are we talking about when we talk about water?
Yeah.
Are we talking about the molecular structure? Are we talking about all of its aspects? Which aspects are we talking about? But once we get clear, I think we can then distinguish between the aspects of water that actually depend on consciousness, like the wetness, which
Right.
depends on how you experience it. And then the molecular structure that causes that. And those aren't the same, right? I mean, and then you just use the same argument, the same reasoning to see that they're different. The cause isn't the same as the effect. Those are different.
Right. So the whole the work that this argument is doing is it is showing that even if they belong to the same reality, which we say they do, they belong to you, thoughts and brain states, even if they belong to the same reality.
I have a brain, but my brain belongs to me.
Right. It's part of Josh, right? They are not the same thing. They're not identical, right? Mm-hmm.
They're not thereby identical. Yeah,
and,
right.
And that is an important discovery, right? Mm-hmm.
It's an important distinction. Absolutely right.
Uh-huh.
Yes. And I don't even know if I would say that these things are parts of me. The term part is sort of variable in its usage, but at minimum, I have these things, right? So I have thoughts, I have brain states, and they're interconnected.
Mm-hmm.
I like to give the example that like when my wife plays the piano, the keys pressing are connected with music playing and my experience of the music. But my experience of the music isn't the same thing as the keys pressing. And so those are connected, but they're not thereby the same thing. And that's really, really important because I think people sometimes rush to other questions about, okay, well, how is consciousness related to the brain? But before we get to those questions, it's very helpful to get clear what is the nature of consciousness itself.
Yeah.
Because if consciousness just is a complex shape or complex pattern or a function from shape inputs to shape outputs, then a different set of answers is available to you in terms of how consciousness comes to be.
Right.
But if consciousness is not the same thing as a shape or pattern, it's not expressible in the vocabulary of physics, then you can remove some answers off the table. And that's a kind of progress. I think sometimes people leap too quickly to the hardest questions. And it's like, let's slow this down. Let's make some progress. Let's get some clarity. That's why I start with eliminativism. I think it can be clear that you have thoughts and feelings. I think it can also be clear. I agree with John Searle on this. He thinks that the reductive thesis that thoughts and feelings reduce to brain states is actually no better than eliminativism because in effect, it eliminates the first person qualitative aspect of consciousness.
Right.
I mean, I guess technically it doesn't eliminate it. It reduces it. But to reduce it is just to say that first person qualitative aspect, that's not really what you think it is. It's actually this thing over here.
Yeah.
And to me, that's like saying, blue, this is red. Red is not the same as blue. They just, let's say this is the brain state and this is the conscious state, right? And the eliminativist is saying this is gone.
Yep.
The reductionist is saying, you know what, this is real, but here's what it is. It's this. That's what it is. And I'm saying if I'm sure of anything, it's that this is not that, because I can compare them and see directly that they're not the
Right.
same
The
thing.
direct comparison
I believe that's the
yeah.
case. So you have to
Mhm.
have two things here, or at least you have consciousness. We can even ask, what is matter? But let's
Mhm.
say that you also have matter. There's two things here, and they're connected. Okay,
Yeah.
they're connected. So if you affect the one, if you change the brain state, it'll affect the mental states. Change the mental state, it'll affect the brain state. They're connected. See, I'm showing they're connected,
Yep.
but it
Mhm.
doesn't mean they're the same thing.
Yeah, beautiful. And I love this because it connects with how I've told you I kind of feel about philosophy of mind right now. I feel like I've just kind of been going through this long process of eliminating options.
Eliminating options.
Yeah, but like,
Yes.
okay, like quite confident that this isn't right. And then just setting constraints of what and then continuing to explore what I think the best account is. And I suggest that more progress will be made once I finish your book here, Josh.
Thank you.
So I'm looking forward to that. Okay, so we got that argument on the table now. Yeah, so I guess to put it in context, what sort of constraints does if people find this a convincing consideration, what sort of constraints is that putting in place for us at this point?
That
Right?
generating consciousness is not merely a matter of getting matter into the right
Of
configuration.
moving shapes around.
Yeah.
Right.
There's more required. And this is exactly Chalmers' point, right? He says science in principle is not going to solve this hard problem of explaining consciousness,
Yeah.
because in principle science is studying third person physical aspects, and consciousness is something else entirely.
Yeah.
And so we can talk about how third person physical aspects might be able to produce consciousness,
Mhm.
but then we have to introduce something else, like maybe there's some kind of a law that describes the production of consciousness from non-consciousness, and
Right.
we can talk about that.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, right? Because the way this was always a very powerful consideration to me. The sort of qualitative abyss, as it's sometimes called, is if you think that
Yeah.
all of reality at bottom is just, I like how you use sand or dust to simplify it, but it's physical stuff that is essentially everything that it's like the complete opposite of consciousness, right? There's no teleology, there's no intentionality, there's no awareness, there's no directedness, right? It's got none of that
Yeah.
stuff, right? It's just anything that
It's
consciousness is,
mindless.
it's none of that, right?
That's
But
it.
then
Yes.
somehow, if we have enough of these things or enough time to rotate them or put them in, swirl them around or whatever, right? Being a little
Yeah.
cartoonish, but this is essentially it, right? That somehow we'll have this perfect qualitative inverse. Like it will just flip into everything that is entirely the opposite of what it was. And granted, that's not much of an argument that I just gave, but that just seems so magical to me that I've never been able to honestly think that that's a possibility. Or if that is a possibility,
Mhm.
and this is your point, there has to be more to the story.
There's
Like
more to the story. Like
that
maybe there's
can't,
a law that describes
right. There
once the
can't,
sand
yeah.
takes a certain shape,
Right.
ghosts come out of it, or
A
whatever,
new,
thoughts come out.
or a new substance is
That's it. Yeah.
is brought into being, or a new the old idea of the giver of forms. A new form is given, like that. I
Mhm.
can accept, right? Because now then you can, I guess, have an idea of emergence, but now you have an account of how emergence is possible. But if it's just the scenario described before and nothing else,
Yes.
then I don't see how emergence is possible. But if we want emergence, then I don't think I have any issue with that. We want to, I guess, an account how, a story how, if that makes sense, right? Mhm.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we're talking about emergence, I think sometimes when people hear these conversations about consciousness, there's already kind of a pre-existing breakdown of the options. And
Mm.
so I think some people, when they hear us talk about emergence, they might think that, well, you know, theists, those who believe in a fundamental mind or supreme mind, they're going to want to resist emergence because they're going to say God created all the conscious beings.
Mhm.
But actually, I don't say that. So I think consciousness does emerge, but the
Yeah.
question is, how does it emerge?
Mhm.
Right? I mean, even if there's a supreme being that has supreme powers, it can't create square circles, or I mean, I don't think it can do impossible things. It only has possible powers, and so even a
Right.
supreme mind is going to
Mhm.
be constrained by what's logically possible.
Mhm.
And so I don't even think that all the power in the world could turn this cup into a feeling of happiness,
Right.
if that's impossible, right?
Mhm.
And so then we want to figure out, okay, well, if there is an emergence here,
Mhm.
how does that work? And one of my thoughts on this is that I actually observe within me thoughts emerging. Okay. So there is a kind of emergence of thoughts from me, a conscious being. So one of the things that I argue for in the book, and I argue for this from many different angles, every chapter actually points to the same result from a new angle. So I give many independent reasons to think this, which is that the elements you notice within consciousness emerge in the context of an already existing being or a mind. And so this pushes the question back. How do you get a conscious being, right? So I talk about, if you wanted to build a conscious being, and if this was your assignment, you might try starting by building the thinking chip, the emotion chip, the feeling chip, the desire chip, the hoping chip. You build all these chips, and maybe you give a different team of scientists a project. You work on the thinking chip, and you work on the emotion chip, and then they all work for decades, and they produce their chips, and they're like, okay, this is actually feeling. It's not just acting like it's feeling; it's having first-person sensations. Of course, how do you know that it is, right? But let's just say, that they've come to believe that this thing is actually feeling. They bring all the chips together, put them on a table, and then the question is, okay, how can you assemble these chips together to form not just this thing's thinking, this thing's feeling, this thing's having hopes, but there's this one being that organizes them all into a single conscious unity, right? This is the binding problem, or the problem of how you bind these things together. Well, this whole task is very difficult if the first thesis in my book is right, which is that you can't build a thinking chip without a thinker, because thoughts come from thinkers, beings that can think. You can't actually build a feeling chip without a feeler, a being that can feel. So that actually you can't start by building the chips and then build the being. You literally, to build thoughts and feelings and emotions and those things, you have to start by building the first person conscious self, the being, that's then able to generate thoughts, feelings, and emotions. Those things emerge if there's already a being. So now the problem's even harder than it was, because we have to first figure out how to build the being. How do you do that? From throwing sand in the air, or if we're creating a chip, how does it make a being, the conscious being? And that's a very hard problem. That's more than just the problem of how do you go from changes in complexity of shapes to a categorical change in the qualitative experience of consciousness. This is a separate problem entirely.
Right.
Even if you can solve that first problem, there's also the problem of organizing these things into a single being.
Right. Yeah, that is absolutely fascinating. Do you want to keep on this path and talk about that more, or do you want to?
I'm not sure. Did you have another thought? We can keep building, right? Because I think where we're at in the conversation is we're kind of starting with that identity question: what is consciousness?
Right.
And then we're considering, well, how does consciousness come to be?
Right. The construction issue.
The construction issue. And one of the problems there is how you assemble the things into a conscious being, that binding problem.
Right. So what we've kind of covered so far, to summarize, is that we have an argument on the table. But of course, what I love about your work is you always give multiple supporting and converging lines. That, whatever else consciousness is, it just doesn't seem to be identical to the let's say the public data, right? That whatever that is, brain states, et cetera. Right. There's, and if the Ross argument's convincing, then we have this idea that it can't be physical in any sense that at least a physicalist would think of physicality, right? So I guess that would commit a Rossian to it being an immaterial reality,
or at least having some immaterial aspects,
or having immaterial aspects, right? And he that's why I think he focuses mostly on formal thinking, right? And now we're trying to consider, okay, how do we get something like that? How do we build something like that? And you've talked about the problem being perhaps even more significant than people realize, because it's gonna depend on a being or a substance of a particular kind of how do we get that thing up and running in the first place. So I'm just trying to give like I
love that
10,000 foot view summary of what we've covered so far, because there's been a lot of really good stuff in here. Okay, so all right, you tell us where to go next. Where should we go
Well,
from here?
I was thinking maybe there's three things I hope we can touch on. So one is
Okay.
about how consciousness interacts with brains.
Yeah.
Like, what are brains? Why are there brains?
Yeah.
If the conscious being doesn't arise out of physical states, apart from consciousness, well, then what is the role of a brain in the first place? Right. So that's one question. The another
Yeah.
is, you mentioned Ross's argument. In the book, I have a related argument that I developed, which is this counting argument about the nature of thoughts.
I definitely wanted to talk
And
about
we
that
can
one. Yeah.
touch back on that because it yields two conclusions. One is that thoughts don't reduce to physical states, but then also that thoughts aren't even determined by physical states and not even determinable by physical states. At least, and let me make sure this is clear, at least if there's not already a mind present. Because I already made the argument, thoughts, I think, emerge in the context of a mind.
Right.
So if there's a mind present, then physical states are relevant to influencing thoughts. But if it's just complete mindless dust or cosmic debris, then my counting argument would yield the conclusion that that could never make thoughts in principle. And it's not just this construction problem. It's a new argument.
Yep.
And then the third thing would be to just develop a little bit further the sort of problems with producing consciousness, apart from what we've already talked about. So there's a lot there.
Let's take it one at a time. That'd be beautiful. So the first one, let's just acknowledge it. Well, I guess one of the first things that attracts people to maybe a materialist or physicalist or just broadly naturalist view is like, look, clearly there's like some relationship here. You bonk somebody over a head, right? And like, oh, they pass out. That's nothing new, right? Like Aristotle knew that, right? But at the same time, like, I don't think Aristotle would be surprised by that because the way he thought about things as a hylomorphist was, I would say, kind of like a deeper integratedness than I think certain dualists might think about it these days. And this is where like I kind of am undecided in some respects. Like these seem like both plausible options to me, and in some respects, some of the motivations that materialists consider are kind of the motivations that might push me more towards a hylomorphic consideration.
Yes.
But then there's other considerations that kind of move me. So you see, like these are actually open questions for me at this point.
Yeah.
But yeah, back to you on this stuff.
Yeah. Well, and if I could just join you on these labels, because I think kind of what happens is people enter into the field of the philosophy of mind.
Yeah.
They have a few loose ideas, and then they pretty quickly discover the camps that are at war with each other.
Yeah.
So you've got the Thomists, the dualists of various stripes, the idealists, the physicalists of various stripes. And one thing that, as you know, that I like to do is just start over. Okay?
I love it. I'm the same way too. The only reason I use labels, and I'm always hesitant because people have associations with them, and then you get trapped by it. But then you're like, but then they'll associate things with you, but you'll be like, no, I actually don't. I don't ascribe to that part, at least. Like maybe other parts. So I'm with you. I'm always very hesitant. So I appreciate your wanting to just start fresh.
I mean, it is very helpful to give people a sense of kind of where we're at and where we're going, right?
Yeah.
But I like to just start over because, for the reason you just pointed out, is that if you point to a theory like dualism, there's already like 5 things that people will associate with dualism, and it may have nothing to do with the particular theory that I have in mind.
Yeah.
And then also, I like to start over is because I've noticed from just talking to philosophers and reading the literature that philosophers do use these terms differently.
Yes.
There is a kind of translation problem. And so that's why I like to just begin with, okay, let's focus on clear things within consciousness, thoughts, feelings. Let's start making some distinctions slowly, carefully. And then once I come to a view, I'll then talk about how maybe that view could be labeled in these different ways.
Sure.
Even at the end of the book, I go through some of the different labels, the panpsychism, idealism, a kind of fundamental mentality view. And I talk about actually what the view that I arrive at has in common with each of those views. But I mean, I hesitate to use any of those views as the label for my view.
Right.
I've been discovering this increasingly so, because anytime I use a label, people do seem to have these kind of associations. And so it's very, very helpful just to
they often tend to be unhelpful emotional associations too, in certain
sometimes,
ways,
especially in the popular culture, but even in sort of cool academic settings, there's just ruts. I think minds sort of get into ruts. And so it's like, this just means that, and here's the story of how this goes. And it's like, I want to stay away from the ruts as long as I can, as much as I can.
Yeah. If we don't need to have unnecessary or Unnecessary barriers. Let's just take them down. I'm with you. That's brilliant. Okay, so I will try to
Brains.
avoid labels for as long as I can for the rest of this conversation. But yeah, let's go back to that first point, the dependency point, I think it was. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I do think labels can be helpful. So, but going back to dependency and brain. So how do they interact? How does that work? How do brains interact with consciousness, right? What are brains for, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so one idea is that, and this is my view, I'll just cut to the chase.
Mm-hmm.
I think of a brain as a kind of user interface for conscious beings to interact with their environment.
Mm-hmm.
And this will actually explain why there's deep connections between the informational states recorded by brains
Mm-hmm.
and your conscious experience.
Mm-hmm.
It's not surprising that informational states can affect conscious experience. An easy example of this would be the informational states recorded in a book. So if you're reading a book, you'll see that there's lots of different geometries. Those geometries are representing information, and you're able to then translate the information into your conscious experience. And if somebody rips pages out of a book that you're reading, that's going to affect your conscious experience.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It doesn't follow that the consciousness is the geometry of the book, or that the book has the consciousness, or even that the book produced the consciousness. Okay, those are the three questions: the identity question, the subject question, and the dependence question.
What a nice analogy. Mm-hmm.
And so, but instead what you have is that the book is facilitating consciousness. I think this is exactly what's happening with brains. Brains are facilitating our experience in this, I call it a state of limitation, in near-death experiences.
Yeah, I was hoping we'd get to bring some of these up. These are one of my favorite things. Yeah,
people report an expanded awareness. Okay,
right,
I've been looking at some of the science here, and what they find is that there are certain contexts where diminished brain activity is correlated with expanded richness of conscious experience.
Yeah,
and I think what's happening there is that when you're in the brain, let's say, if I could use that language, or when the brain is in you, depending on how you think of these things, when you're tightly connected to this body, this brain, the brain is facilitating a certain kind of constraint on your experiences for the sake of meaningful relationship with the world and with each other in this world.
Yeah, that I like this a lot.
But if you depart from this context, then according to these NDE reports, and there's good scientific peer-reviewed investigation on this. If you look at the AWARE study, for example, they do controlled experiments on this. But according to this, you expand your consciousness, you increase the richness of your experience, wholly apart from the expansion of physical material brain states.
Right.
That makes sense if the brain is acting as a facilitator of conscious experience.
Yeah, that's cool. This is a great point to show, to emphasize the point you made earlier of how, hey, look, the science here is actually quite friendly, right, to the overall project. And the NDE research, I think, is so cool. And there's a new kind of field, relatively new, like the past 10, 20 years, on terminal lucidity, which is, they're not near-death experiences, but people who have, dementia. I'm sure you're probably familiar with this, right, too. They have these pockets, right? It might be the last hour of their life or a couple hours of their life where something happens, right? And they're kind of freed up from their physical limitations. They have this profound lucidity, despite the fact that their physical equipment is almost completely deteriorated. So just really fascinating stuff. Emerging from the science standpoint. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's interesting because when I used to think about these studies, I thought, well, as long as there's some possibility of brain activity explaining it, then it would be a leap to say that, well, therefore the mind isn't wholly and completely dependent on the brain. But I think that we don't have to argue in terms of sort of black and white, like if it's possible. We could just look, okay, well, where is the data pointing? I mean, if your consciousness is reducible to brain states, then why is it that when the brain states diminish in their activity and information, there are certain pockets of context where your experiences increase? There's different ways of explaining that.
Well, I like it. I love the way, and you've made this move in other contexts, but I think it's really helpful. Again, we don't have to like completely show that every proposal is impossible for the naturalist. We can just ask more modestly, like, hey, here's a hypothesis, and what might we expect on this hypothesis? versus what might we expect on another hypothesis. And I have to be honest, like if physicalism were true, I would never expect near-death experiences. I just wouldn't, right? But they're the sort of thing that seem quite plausible on, I guess, broad non-physicalist views, right?
Yeah, or a fundamental mentality view where mind
Yeah.
is really fundamental to our reality. Because that can then explain why there are conscious beings that integrate with
Right.
certain kinds of experiences. And I wanted just to add, if I can,
Yep.
it's not just the science of the end of life. There's all sorts of interesting neuroscience about our power to affect the neurological structures of our brains. And they're talking about how you can use mindfulness techniques to heal your brain, to improve your health. And this isn't just like guesswork. I mean, we have lots of different scientific evidence, and you can verify this just through your own experience. I mean, you can actually do your own tests. One thing that I've been doing in light of the science is as I go to sleep at night, I will thank my body for serving me, and I'll think about things that I'm happy about that are going well with me in my life. And then when I wake up in the morning, that'll be some of my first thoughts will be to pay attention to the things that are good.
Yeah, that's so good.
Because that actually affects our bodies, affects our health.
Yeah, I love that. There's a book, good one. You cite it in your book. What is it called again? The Spiritual Brain? Is that it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good one because it reviews a lot of the scientific data. This is kind of a secondary source where these PhD neuroscientists talk about the effects of consciousness on the material structures of the brain.
Yeah, very good. Okay.
And there's a lot of other research that I've been discovering, even just very recently, about our ability to affect the quantum field through our thoughts and our feelings, and not even just affect our brains locally, but to affect other remote systems.
Yeah.
So at Princeton, they've done some research on this, the peer research, peer-reviewed scientific research about consciousness affecting systems. And apparently, we've got a lot of interesting data suggesting that our minds affect things locally and at a distance. It's not that it's magical. It's like maybe there's a mechanism where our thoughts affect the quantum field, and then the quantum field can affect other beings. But this fits very well with the user interface model of brains, I think.
Yeah, very cool. So I love that. All right, what are brains for? Well, we have a user interface. That's a great model. Love it. Anything else you want to say about that before we go to point number 2?
I think that's it. I mean, it's a big topic, right? And so, but
yeah, and by the way, gentle listeners, we will before the end of this conversation, we'll make sure we talk more about your upcoming book. But obviously, we're just scratching the surface here of stuff that is going to be explored much deeper in Josh's new book. So this is just sort of to whet the appetite, if you will.
Thank you.
Good. So yeah, all right. Point 2 was, you'll have to remind me again, Josh. What was it?
So I was just trying to remember. Yeah, so we want to talk about the brain. I want to talk a little bit more about thoughts and my counting argument.
Oh, that's
and
right.
then come back to the problem of constructing conscious beings.
Yeah, excellent.
And that
Very
might be a good place to end with the construction problem. So,
sounds great.
So with the thoughts, it's very interesting because, as you said earlier, Pat, sometimes the things that are familiar to us are actually very significant.
Yes.
And this is a point I often make because I think some of the most familiar things, like our own existence, our own thoughts, our own feelings, are windows into significant aspects of reality. And one of those things is thoughts. I mean, thoughts are just so familiar. You just have thoughts. But like, why does reality include such things as thoughts? Like, how did that ever happen?
Right. Yeah.
And so, one day
it can't actually freak you out, doesn't it? Do you ever just
really
like,
can.
have you ever just been like freaked? Like, I'm just walking sometimes. This happened. I think I'm a little better now, but there's times I'm just walking, like that thought will occur to me. It'll like freak me out, right? Like, this is just so weird, right?
Thoughts are real, and it is weird because it's not just, well, there's some story about how brains are producing thoughts, because there's this much deeper question, which is, how does reality even have the resources to ever result in beings who can be wondering about the nature of reality? Right. The feeling of wondering is itself a very significant aspect of reality.
Yes.
And it's almost like we look past it. The feeling of wondering is like the window through which we're now wondering about the world, but we forgot about the window itself, the wondering feeling itself. It's like, that's part of reality.
Right.
And how did reality produce that? That's quite striking. So, so anyway, back to thoughts. I was thinking about thoughts one morning. This was about a decade or so ago. And this idea occurred to me where I had this picture in my mind of a landscape of shapes, specifically mountains, shapes of mountain peaks, and then thoughts about the mountains.
Yeah.
And it occurred to me that thoughts can be linked together by logical relations like and, or even if. You can have one thought or if another thought, right? And you can have those combinations of thoughts. And so that was like a seed idea that I had for this counting argument that I've published a few different iterations of it. But the basic idea is that you can actually add up more logically possible thoughts than logically possible geometric states. And without going into all the technical details, but the basic idea is that you can take any group of geometric states and then you can have a unique thought about that group.
About that entire group. Yeah.
Yes. And you can have individual thoughts about each part of that group, each member of the group. But then you can link those thoughts together by the logical relations to get a more complex thought that points to the whole group. And so there's a way of making this very precise and very rigorous. I've got this article with philosopher Andrew Bailey.
I'll be sure to link that in the show notes for people who want to get into the weeds of it. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a very technical argument because we have to get into infinities. And, basically, even if there's an infinite number of possible combinations of geometric brain states, I make the argument that the cardinality of the infinity of logically possible thoughts is actually greater using Cantor's theorem, which shows us that you can have different sizes of infinity. In particular, using the procedure that I just used, which is that if you can have every group of brain states correspond to unique thought, then there's going to be at least one unique thought per group of brain states. But by Cantor's theorem, there's more groups of brain states than individual brain states. So then you follows by transitivity that there's more logically possible thoughts than logically possible brain states.
Right. Which means
that's the idea.
Yeah. Which is brilliant because that means now we've got a problem if we wanted to reduce thoughts to brain states because they just outnumber brain states.
It leads to the problem of reduction. And then I discovered it also leads to a problem of generation of thoughts from brain states. Because the idea is that if you can generate thoughts from brain states, the basic picture is that out of the seed of material forms, most of those material forms won't produce any consciousness.
Yeah.
It won't even possibly. But some subset of the material forms will produce conscious thoughts. Okay. But the problem, though, is that if we can use this counting argument to show that there are more logically possible thoughts than logically possible combinations of brain states, then what you can show is that some of those logically possible thoughts can't be the unique products of certain brain states. Can't be.
Yeah.
And then I make a uniformity argument that, well, if some logically possible thoughts can't be unique products of brain states, then thoughts, their variation is they're sort of categorically in the same boat.
Yeah.
And so by kind of uniformity, I make the argument that no thoughts are generated just from brain states by themselves, which I think is already kind of intuitive. I mean, it's like we wouldn't really expect this is not a brain state, right? But I mean, it's a geometric state. We wouldn't expect that, once these things get close enough together, then the thought of lions comes out, right?
I love your props.
We wouldn't. I just have these things here.
Yeah.
We wouldn't really expect that, and I don't think just changing the configuration sort of changes the expectation.
Right. Yeah.
Right. But the counting argument sort of gives an independent line. And if I could just add one more thing here, what you might say is that once these things reach a certain point, there's a law that says, given this arrangement, a thought comes out.
Right.
There's a law. But then what we've done is we've relocated the mystery of consciousness into the mystery of the laws themselves.
Right. And
laws, yes.
I was going to say laws have a certain structure, kind of a thought-like structure. Yeah,
exactly. Right. Yes, absolutely. And so I think that you could actually appeal to laws, but it just pushes thought-like things deeper into the fabric of reality.
Yeah. Oh, that's such a good. I love that. I love that line of thought, and I will encourage people to hopefully listen to that again, because when I first read your paper, I knew it was something special, and I've just come to appreciate it deeper and deeper. Have there been? I haven't really seen. Have there been any like
Responses.
responses to
Yeah.
it yet? Sorry,
I've seen
my
it.
yeah, I'm
Yes,
a
I
little
came
behind
I
today
came
on
across a
the brain
blog.
juice. Yeah. Uh-huh.
I came across a blog post the other day, very well articulated. It was kind of a response, but it was more sort of delimiting what the implications of the argument were.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
There's a philosopher who wrote a blog post responding to my Kantorian argument, but that was before my more careful, rigorous technical version came out, how to build a thought.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I did see somebody give a kind of commentary on that on a YouTube video.
Mm-hmm.
This is all in the pub. I haven't seen any published responses.
Yeah, that's
yet.
that's what I was interested in. Yeah, I think it's really cool. And actually, in a way, I think it connects very well with the way that not just Ross but John Haldane kind of motivate, I think, some of the theses that we're talking about too. I just see a nice sort of like, yeah, that actually makes sense if you think that this other thing makes sense, right? There's just a nice kind of harmony and fittingness between these lines of thought. You know what I mean?
It is true. I mean, I think it can be difficult if you're in a paradigm
Yeah.
where the mindless matter comes first. It can be very hard to flip that around because you can always sort of resist every argument in a way.
Mm-hmm.
You can maybe find another way of explaining it, and that's totally fair, you know. And if people are watching this and they're coming up with objections and their minds are turning and they're thinking, you know, what about this? You know, that's fine. That's fair, because it's a complex subject and there's many ways of looking at this. However, I can just speak from my own experience. If you can just manage to flip it around, you know, and just imagine instead of mindlessness being primary, mentality is primary, and then just go through the scientific data, go through the arguments, and just see how well it fits together.
Yeah, right. There's
You
great
know,
coherence.
there's a great coherence. It's not just one line or one argument. There's lots of different kinds of arguments, conceptual arguments, empirical arguments, many different considerations. And I guess I can only just speak from my own perspective here, just to say that from where I stand, the mind first ontology just makes so much sense of so many things.
Yes,
that now when I flip it back, because I used to have it the other way, I wasn't really sure. It was sort of a duck rabbit. I could see it in both directions. But now when I flip it back and I just imagine mindless units of reality generating not just thoughts and feelings, but first person conscious selves, the kinds of beings like we are, who can have our own thoughts and our own feelings. That just strikes me as very hard now at this point. I mean, it's just to be very frank with you. I mean, to me, the idea of mindlessness producing you and I and all the aspects of us really is on the same absurdity as throwing this thing against the wall and it begins thinking, I'm in pain.
Yeah, I am completely with you at this point. Yeah, completely with you at that point. Points one and two are done. We wanted to get on to the construction problem again, right?
Cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
So so this is the general problem of how you get conscious beings out of the sea of mindlessness. And I always like to say, kind of bird's eye view, that there's two general ways you can approach this and they can go together. One is you think about a probability problem of how probable is it on a theory of a mindless foundation that minds would ever arise. And then specifically the kinds of beings that we witness in our own experience, who can have thoughts, feelings, and purposes and come into relationships. So that's the kind of probability problem. Or sometimes I think of that in terms of prediction, sort of a prediction problem. Okay. And then the other is a sort of in principle problem. It's like in principle impossible to rearrange mindless units of reality to turn them into purposes or beings with purposes.
Right.
And then in that in principle problem, in the book, I divide between three problems. There's a construction problem, the binding problem, which we've talked about, and this identity problem, which I'm not going to talk about. But this has to do with how you identify the being that you are among the sea of other things, atoms and things. Which combination of atoms are you, right? Especially when you lose parts and gain new parts. Like there's a deep identity problem there. But just to sort of conclude on the construction problem, I think of this as the problem of not having the right materials to produce conscious beings.
Yeah.
And this is what we were just pointing to when I was using the Legos. I mean, I think it's illustrated by example together with careful thinking about relevant differences. So it's kind of 2 steps to this. It's like you start with examples, you try to build using Legos a conscious being that has a sense of self. You use Legos to do this, right? Because this, for me, this is what gets the intuition to click. And I don't even know if it's an intuition or if it's actually just direct acquaintance with the reality that shapes and structure aren't the same thing as, and would never make or determine this other kind of thing, the first person consciousness. And then you add the irrelevant differences. You think, okay, well, arrange this into the shape of a neuron, make it function like a neuron. Would it then have consciousness? And I don't claim that this is easy to see. It was not easy for me to see. And even if you see it, you don't thereby have to believe it. There are things I think eliminativists see their own consciousness. They don't have to believe that they have consciousness. So I want to be careful not to overstate this, but I do think I have to also be honest about it. I do think it's possible to see clearly that rearrangements of mindless matter could never be a conscious being. With thoughts and feelings.
Yeah, I agree. And to me, there's always been a deep issue. Maybe this is part of your identity question of a stability issue. What accounts for stability, right? We live in a very stable world, not just our conscious experience, right? Of course, something can come and totally obliterate me, but otherwise it's just very stable, right? And that's always just struck me as just something that is worthy of deep contemplation, but often doesn't seem to enter into the conversation very often. Stability. Okay, Josh. So do you have time for a question or two from the audience? And are there any other thoughts that you wanted to make sure we got out or mentioned about your book in general or the research you've been doing on this?
Yeah, I think just that because this is a difficult topic and because experts disagree,
right?
What I try to do in the book is to empower readers to see their own powers in a sense. And then I guess I'm not the one empowering them, but I'm pointing to their own powers because I think each person has great power to see things by the clearest light for themselves. And what you see from your perspective may not be what I see, but it might actually be more relevant to your questions. So when it comes to consciousness, I just really want to invite people to really take up their own powers and pay attention to their thoughts and turn it over in your own mind. Like, yeah, what is my consciousness? And really pay attention. I think that gives you the most power to come to conclusions that are going to be the most relevant to you.
Yeah, brilliant. Let me just say again, in a couple days, I'll give away some copies of Josh's previous book, How Reason Can Lead to God. So if you're catching this interview, just leave a comment, leave us your thoughts or your questions, and I'll just pick a few people for that. It's such a good book, Josh. It's one I return to regularly. Also, Josh, before we finish up with a question or two, what's the best way for people to keep up with you and your work so that way when the new book comes out, they'll be able to snag a copy immediately?
Okay. Worldview-design.com. That's a member site. That's probably the easiest way to be in connection with the latest developments of my work.
Wonderful resource too, definitely.
Yes. So otherwise, just joshuarasmussen.com. You can get free resources there. That's my homepage. And I'm just sort of itching to add here. I love what you just said a moment ago about stability, because that I think is a kind of neglected observation. Just like right now in our very conversation, there's a kind of stability to our ability to think and process what you're saying and what I'm saying. And this arises out of a world where it's fundamentally, if you think in terms of particles just moving this way and that way.
Right. Like this
right
is always
now,
just
it's not the beginning of time, but like right now, like chemical reactions going on in my brain.
Right. Why aren't they just exploding?
There's a kind of interesting stability there. And that's where I have a kind of mentality that's actually foundational. That does predict a certain kind of stability. For sure. Now, I just want to highlight what you said there, because I don't talk about that in my book. And I think you're right that this is not often thought about, but it's a really nice point that you're bringing up. And I think that also could be a window into greater understanding as well.
Yeah. It's one that's always just kind of been in the back of my mind on a number of things. And of course, you do talk about it in the Bridge of Reason of how if you have the supreme foundation, that is going to predict, of course, continued existence in a broad
That's it.
sense. So
Yeah.
that solves that problem. Because I mean, that's
Yeah.
a big thing, right? If we just look at
That's right.
contingency, I remember when I was a kid, I just used to look out. I guess this is how you're going to spend your life philosophizing. Right? I would look out my grandparents when I was very young and just wonder, like, why doesn't everything just go poof? Right? This was like
Yeah.
a
Right.
haunting question for me, and some obviously it followed me around for a while.
Yeah.
So,
It
anyways,
still stays with you. I can feel that. Yeah.
yeah. So the stability considerations are, but
Yeah.
I think they're interesting for consciousness and conversation and stuff like that
Yeah,
too.
and laws, right? Because
Right.
minds produce laws.
Right.
All the
Yeah.
laws that we really know about come from minds, right?
Right.
So why not just expand that to laws of reality as
Yeah.
well?
Awesome. All right. Well, let's take a conversation or two here.
good.
Then we'll let question or two. Excuse me. Brendan says first. I wanted to say I love your book Bridge of Reason. Oh yeah. So Josh, that's your wonderful. That came out before How Reason Can Lead to God. And
That's the one that I created because you had me on your podcast, and I
yeah.
was like, I got to write this little book before I go on to Pat's podcast. So thank you for inspiring that. If it weren't for you, that book would not exist.
Well, thank you, because it's a great resource. So if nothing else, people should definitely pick up a copy of that as well. And then we might have already answered this, Josh. Maybe you just want to reiterate it. Brendan wants to know why. Yeah, why do you think panpsychism it doesn't give us the full account here?
So two things here. First, I think panpsychism is in the right direction insofar as it recognizes that consciousness is fundamental to reality. There are different versions of panpsychism. I'm actually going to be having a conversation with Philip Goff on his panpsychism next year.
Oh, cool.
And so that's going to be fun. That's going to be on the Christian Idealism YouTube channel. But so first, I just want to know, I think it's in the right direction. There is this combination problem about how you can take little bits of consciousness and organize them into a single conscious self. So there is that problem. Now, one way a panpsychist might be able to solve that problem or point to a solution is in terms of a fundamental consciousness that is itself organized and unified. Philip Leon, in his dialogue with me on Is God the Best Explanation of Things,
really good
talks
book.
about something like this, a kind of cosmic panpsychism. And I think that's even going further in the right direction. But I think if we keep going in that direction, we just arrive at a kind of broadly theistic model where, you shave off the arbitrary limits and fundamental reality is a non-limited supreme mental reality, a mind, a being.
Yeah.
And I think that the big problem, though, still just is how do you get the first person conscious self, not just the consciousness, but how do you get it organized into conscious selves?
Yeah.
And so
it seems in some ways it sort of relocates the problem.
That's it. Yeah.
Rather than actually solving it. Right.
Yeah. Or if it does solve it, then I think it kind of transforms into the view that I have myself.
Right. Yeah.
That reality is a fundamental supreme mind.
Right. Yeah. That certainly has the resources to produce beings like us. Right. Here's a interesting question here. Otanglo, if I'm pronouncing that right, wants to know, what is the difference between a physicalist and an atheist?
Yeah. So an atheist you could think of as somebody, right, who does not think that there is a God. And then a physicalist, if we're talking about consciousness, you could have a physicalist account of consciousness and still think that God exists.
Right.
Okay. Now, let me clarify this a bit, because you might think, well, isn't God's consciousness not physical? So when philosophers focus on consciousness, a lot of times they'll narrow the scope to human consciousness. And so there are philosophers who are theists who would still be physicalists. So what they would say is that there's a physical world that God created, and out from that physical world comes all the other consciousness. That would be kind of form of physicalism.
Right.
You can perhaps get creative and even think that maybe even God has a kind of physicality. So even God's consciousness is physical. So that's at least a concept. There's some conceptual room for that, right?
Yeah.
You can also be an atheist and not a physicalist, right? So this goes back to what we were saying earlier in the show, which is that there's sort of this interesting survey where it shows that there's more atheists than physicalists among the philosophers of mind, at least on the previous survey that I saw there. And how does this work? Well, I think the way this works is, I'm thinking now of an atheist philosopher who once told me that he's a substance dualist, and is basically from the considerations we've been talking about. So he thinks that consciousness is not reducible to physical states, and there's more to you than matter.
Right.
But he's not thereby persuaded that reality itself has a fundamental supreme mind.
Mm-hmm.
And if I could just say something else about this, I mean, like Philip Goff, I think he would call himself at least agnostic, because even though he thinks he wouldn't call himself a physicalist, because he thinks that consciousness is prior, embedded within the material world, but he's not thinking that fundamental reality is organized into a supreme being.
Yes. Yeah, excellent. Those are really helpful distinctions, Josh. Thank you for that. Let's finish with this one, because I think it connects well with some of the other questions, at least the first one with panpsychism. Running wants to know why I'm trying to make sense of this. Why God instead of a conscious, maybe even personal first cause, or why couldn't God, why couldn't God just be a being with minimal power rather than maximal power? Seems to be the question, right? Yeah. So what would be your thoughts on this, Josh?
Which makes more and more things until we get all the power. Oh, okay. Yeah. So I would want to think here about what it would mean to avoid those arbitrary limits. So I'll just kind of say how I think of things here is that if this fundamental reality has personal qualities, like let's say it's got the quality of having purposes, it can finely tune a universe that unfolds into a universe like what we see. It's got this kind of power to do that. And then you say, well, why think that its power is maximal or supreme? Well, my thought is if it's not a maximal power, then it's going to have some limit in that power. It's going to have some limit in its cognitive power. It's going to have some limit in its person producing powers. And I would think that that limit is going to be arbitrary unless there's a deeper explanation for that limit. So, why would fundamental reality, which it has certain kinds of powers to aim and produce people, why would it have a certain particular limit? Let's say it has the limit to produce a universe with 10 to the 82 particles and no more. It's like, well, why does it have exactly that number built in? And Pat, you and I have talked about this in terms of sort of the fundamental nature of fundamental reality, right? And this is a longer conversation, but I think it makes a lot of sense if the fundamental nature of fundamental reality is simply supreme or perfect. And I think that actually predicts that it's going to have supreme power, supreme cognitive power. And so therefore it's not going to have sort of a minuscule or minimal amount of power.
Right. Yeah.
But there's more there to think about in terms of maybe it could produce one kind of a thing, which then could produce another kind of thing. But I don't think that the supreme thing itself can be depleted, because I think that it itself just already has the fullness of being or the fullness of power.
And it seems just like from observation, there's a difference between does it have limited power versus minimal power, right? Because what would minimal power be? I think it would be less than the power it clearly already has, right? It produced a universe, at least this one, if it exists, seems to be.
Well, maybe it has just enough power to produce our universe, right?
Right.
And
but couldn't it have less power, right? So our universe, like maybe it just has that limited power, which your argument shaves those limits off, right? But it does seem at least possible that like it could have produced a universe with less particles, right? You see what I'm saying? Like,
yeah, exactly. It's sort of a contingent. It's like, why does it have that amount of power? That seems to call for deeper explanation.
What I'm saying is it seems like it clearly doesn't.
It has to at least have the power to produce our universe,
right? It clearly doesn't have minimal power because it produced the universe. So like that's pretty powerful power, right?
Has it? Yeah.
This guys were saying. Anyway, that's a really good question. I appreciate it, and I would say, it's a long time ago now, Josh. We've known each other for a while now, probably almost two, maybe 3 years ago, where we did that first conversation where we went deeper into your argument from limits. So I would say check that out if you haven't seen that again. Josh, thank you so much. This has been an absolutely blast of a conversation. Again, I will link your website, your personal website, and Worldview Design in the show notes. And I want to encourage people to really check that out. It's a really awesome resource. And I know that you posted a sort of a conversation that we had recently through email that was very helpful and fruitful for me.
Yes, you asked a wonderful question, and I thought my answer would be helpful. So I've been posting approximately each week, I'll post an answer to a question. And so then that shows up there.
Yeah. So, well, tease it a little bit more. What can people kind of? I want to get people excited about this world design. What are some of the things that people can expect there, and some of the different
People can
courses that you're
connect.
offering? Yeah, right.
Yeah, so I've got a cosmological investigations course in there, 6-part
Yeah.
video series.
Mm-hmm.
And there are other circle leaders who have their own channels, and then they're providing original content in there.
Mm-hmm.
I mentioned the Christian Idealist channel, for example.
Yep.
There's other ones. And yeah, it's a place to connect with people who are really thinking hard about the biggest questions about God and reality. And I really created this with my wife, Rachel, so that we can have a place for people to seek truths that are treasures together, in a kind of cooperation, get connected with the leaders in the field. And so it's new. I mean, it's still less than a year old. And I think that while there's a lot of room for its growth along the lines of its core founders, its original members having certain desires. And so I'm very excited about where we're going with that.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, I'll be sure to link that. And again, I want to encourage everybody to please check that out and take advantage. And Josh, thank you again. This has been an absolute blast. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.